One person has been arrested in connection with a deadly fire at the Usindiso building that's last August in Marshalltown in the Joburg CBD. At least 77 people died in that incident. For more on this, we're joined now by Nigel Braken, Marshalltown Fire Justice Campaign and Social Worker. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. A witness dropped a bombshell at the Commission of Inquiry into this fire. 77 people were killed over attempts to conceal a murder. But with that in mind, we're also learning from a legal expert that perhaps that evidence is inadmissible in a court of law because the suspect was not properly informed of his rights. What's your take on this confession? What did you make of it?
Obviously, we've been working with the victim since the fire began, and it's shocking to hear that. To hear that this was intentional, that what was going on in the building, and I think it's very easy as part of the. It's very easy as part of the narrative to just go straight and say, okay, this person is responsible for the deaths. But I think we've also heard some other very compelling evidence as to. There's certainly a person who sparked the fire, and this person was responsible for getting that fire going, and also for that. It's a heinous act of murder under crystal meth, under the instructions of a drug lord, going out and intentionally buying petrol to cover it up and then running out of the building. But we have to also be mindful of kind of some other context stuff. So, number one, the city of Joburg, they never arrived on the scene. The fire department had between 3 and 5 fire trucks available on the day of the fire, and should have between 112 and 120 in terms of the national standards. So much of the fire equipment, the fire trucks weren't certified. They couldn't get into the building in the way that they needed to as a result of not having the correct equipment and not having, all of the, and of course the firefighters did what they could, but a lot of deaths could have been avoided if we had a working fire service. And then broader to that context, of course, is the conditions in the building. And the conditions in the building were such that we've also heard testimony about the fact this building's owned by the city. We had a fire expert last week tell us that owners are responsible for making sure that fire standards are upheld. And we know there's a lot of buildings that are in a very derelict state in the city of Joburg. And we can't excuse the city of Joburg from not taking its responsibility as an owner to make sure that fire safety standards were in place.
Yeah.
And then that goes into the broader context of course, the housing crisis in the city, and then, of course, the socio-economic crisis, and the fact that we're not delivering on the promises of 1994, and we continue to force people to make decisions to live in conditions like these,
So as you interacted, you spoke about how you engaged with the witness. What was your assessment of this witness? A 29-year-old man confessing to this, and, his composure. He's reported to have broken down in tears as he told the panel of the commissioners that he frequently prayed that God would punish him for his actions, which, of course, led to the dozens of deaths.
Yeah. I don't know how to respond to that, to be honest. It's horrific, So it's an incredibly horrible thing that's happened, and you can imagine he is distraught. One of my colleagues was involved in counselling him. I can't go into the details around that, but can you just imagine how you must feel having done that? But I think we also need to be aware that there's been a horrific crime that's been committed. Not only has a murder been committed and then an attempt to cover up that murder, it's resulted in a lot of people, and people I've also been sitting with for the last couple of months, listening to their stories. I was listening to a young boy. He's 21. He's lost his mother, his father, his older brother, and his younger brother, and his little brother. He sent me a picture the other day of his younger brother, who is just a toddler. Says he still hasn't managed to locate him. We've still got 42 bodies in the mortuary that we haven't been able to identify who they belong to. And this kid hasn't been able to identify his little brother. So, the horror of this. And then, of course, we've got the situation where the city's placed a lot of these victims into even more vulnerable conditions. So many of the South African victims have been moved to a place called Denver, which is outside of the city, and just kind of, it seems that the city's policy is to invisibilize the poor, So we blame the poor for non-delivery of, the promise of 94 was that we'd have housing for all. That's what we were supposed to deliver. We were supposed to deliver dignified housing. We were supposed to deliver economic development and flourishing in our communities. And instead what we've delivered is this horrible situation where people still continue to live in apartheid-like conditions. And then we move them out of the city. So the people in Denver, we warned the city. We went to the High Court and warned the city that there's going to be flooding at that place. There was testimony about flooding that had happened previously. And despite that, they still moved these victims of a fire to a place, and now they've been flooded 4 times. 4 times. Can you imagine? You've been through a fire, you've lost your loved ones, and now you get moved to a place where you experience flooding, and you moved out of the city, away from work, away from education. It's horrific. So, I mean, everything about this, it's not just we hear these horrific testimony yesterday. It just caused incredible anguish, anger, despair. But then the whole situation that we're faced with is a situation that is making a lot of us very angry and despairing. We feel betrayed by a government that promised us a different social compact,
What impact do you think such a confession has on the bigger scope, the case that's underway and under scrutiny?
Yeah, so I'm a social worker and working as well with the Johannesburg fire victim support group. So we've been formally engaging with all the victims, and we've had lawyers, Norton Rose Fulbright, who've helped us. And they've collected just on 340 statements from all of the victims in the fire and all of those stories. And of course, the Commission of Inquiry's got 2 parts. The first part is trying to establish what happened in the fire, why it happened. And the second part is the broader implications of these buildings. And again, it just goes to these broader issues. And I think this certainly does just put to bed in my book anyway. There's still more details that I've got questions because, having looked at a lot of the statements, I'm not 100% convinced that all the T's are dotted and the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. I think there still needs a little bit more clarity in what happened. But it certainly puts to bed, yes, the fire was caused by this kind of thing. But we're having lots of fires like this happening in the city. Yes. We had one just the other day where another 2 people were killed. And this goes to the broader condition of a lot of these buildings. And that goes to kind of 40, 50 years these buildings have been deteriorating, and the government hasn't taken action against building owners to hold them accountable. Eventually, people take the law into their own hands in the buildings. They occupy the buildings themselves. They form boycott committees, and there's a process that kind of happens as buildings get taken over by communities. People with kind of evil objectives move in and hijack the buildings and demand rent from new residents, and it becomes these inner city slums. And that's not what we need in terms of the housing stock in the city of Joburg. The fact that we've got 1,000 odd bad buildings in the inner city, that's the real crisis here. And I think that's the crux of the question we have to ask is, what are we going to do to provide dignified housing for all in the inner city? And what are we going to do to break the apartheid spatial framing and planning? So even in the way the city's responded to the Denver crisis, move the poor out of the city. And that's what the apartheid government did. They created these little townships all over so that black people didn't need to come anywhere near the rich and the powerful white people. It's just like the same sort of apartheid philosophy is in place in our city. And you hear these politicians, and I hate to say it, the MMC for public safety and his rhetoric that he's coming, blaming foreigners is straight away. We saw that at the beginning of the building when the fire first came out. Foreigners are to blame. Then we find out, we've interviewed the witness. The majority of people in that building were in fact South Africans. The person who lit the match was a South African. This guy was a South African. But again, it's just scapegoating to take away the responsibility for the bigger issues. And the real question we've got to hold our government accountable to is not what do we do with foreigners, how do we scapegoat them and chase them out of South Africa, because that is not the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is we've got to work at economic development, we've got to work out our proper housing policies, and we've got to turn the city around and create housing that is dignified and available to all. That was the promise of 94. And we've got to get back to that promise, that dream that we all longed for.
Yeah.
Nigel,
very quickly, I mean, you make mention of the other building that was gutted and left 2 people dead, and 200 others have now been displaced since that Sunday fire on Commissioner Street in the Joburg CBD. You've spoken a great deal about the problem, but what sort of approach do you think the government is failing in addressing this matter? How are they failing in their approach?
So it's very, I mean, I remember in 94, when we had the high crime kind of situation, the first response was, hey, let's bring back the death penalty. And these are knee-jerk kind of responses. It doesn't address crime. In the same way, we're not going to address the housing crisis by evicting all of the people from the inner city and creating spaces for the middle class to move into. We have to ask the question, what kind of society do we want? Do we want a society that's inclusive? Do we want a society where all belong? So the kinds of responses I would imagine is that we've got to get proper development of inner city buildings. We've got to make sure owners are held accountable to maintain buildings. Buildings that are not being maintained, we need to look at how do we renovate those buildings and how do we provide housing stock for the people living in those buildings. The poor are not the enemy. We need to get out of our minds this idea and this notion that we've got to invisibilize the poor in order for Joburg to be a, inverted commas, clean city. No, Joburg needs to be a vibrant city that exists for everybody. And when we get that vision in place, then we need to say, well, how do we meet the practical needs of people in the city? How do we provide water? What do we do in terms of getting fire safety into these buildings? And we need to do it in creative ways because at the moment, a lot of our buildings are already in slums. And so how do we get that back? I don't know. But I do know that we've got to stop just this idea of giving it over to private people who run it for profit and then just let it crumble and don't follow any laws and regulations as soon as they stop making a profit,
Yeah.
We've got to find ways to make this work.
Nigel Braken, thank you very much. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. Marshalltown Fire Justice Campaign and social worker Nigel Braken there giving his view.